Okay, well then I will go ahead and get started. Welcome to our APA Division 15 webinar co-hosted by AERA's Teaching Educational Psychology SIG. Thank you so much to our chairs, Dr. Corinthia Nicolai and Dr. Yin Chen and Dr. Joshua Archer. We're really excited to have you here with us today. My name is Molly Taylor, and I am a graduate student in educational psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I'm just going to get us started with our introductions of our amazing panelists today. So the session of this title is Doing the Work When It Matters Most, Teaching Critical Topics in the Current U.S. Sociopolitical Climate. And we're very excited to introduce our moderators for today. I'm just going to pull up my notes real quick so I can get y'all's affiliations and everything correct. One second. I forgot to do presenter mode. So we're just going to do that real quick. Okay. So let's see. There we go. Apologies for talking through everything. It's always fun when you're on Zoom. Okay, so our presenters for today include Dr. or Mrs. Kelly P. Tharp, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum Foundations and Reading at Georgia Southern University's College of Education. Since 2007, Kelly Tharp has taught undergraduate teacher preparation courses in diversity, educational psychology, critical and contemporary education issues, child development, and assessment of elementary children. Between 1991 and 2007, she taught middle grades in English in Virginia and was a middle school assistant principal in North Carolina, as well as an elementary school principal in Statesboro, Georgia. All of her teaching and administrative roles have been in diverse settings, and her focus is on ensuring equity and advocacy for all students. Next, we have Dr. Tennisha Riley, who is an assistant professor of youth development and prevention science at the University of Florida. She has taught undergraduate and grad level courses in psychological science and human development and family studies. Her research focuses on emotional development and emotion regulation during adolescence, with particular attention to how social contexts like families, peer relationships, and schools shape emotional processes. And then lastly, we have Mr. Alan Crawford Jr., who is a 34-year-old history teacher at Toledo Waite High School. He's a recent graduate of Grand Canyon University with a master's degree in secondary education with an emphasis in humanities. Mr. Crawford has a passion for people, particularly his students, and believes in the value of cultivating relationships in order to achieve education goals. And with that, I will turn it over to our wonderful other moderators to get started on our questions.
Oh, I think this is Kelly's turn.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, great. Hi, can you hear me? Just want to make sure everybody can hear me. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that if Kelly has some slides, you can share them.
Thank you. And I'm going to share mine so you can kind of see, and hopefully you can see that as it comes up here. So one of the, I appreciate being a part of this discussion. It's obviously really important. And it's increasingly important over the 35 years I've been in education. I just really have seen and I share you all's rising concern about how to continue to cover critical equity issues and diversity issues and content that are meaningful to our P-12 students in public schools, as well as our teacher ed candidates. That's been a increasingly difficult concept. These are the courses that I have taught, as the introduction said. I really just want to focus on this red highlighted course because even though obviously all courses and teacher ed programs need to integrate and do integrate critical issues, within the content, I think this was probably the most directly relatable to our discussion today, especially with limited time for our discussion. So talking about this pre-professional block class, it's EDUC 2120. It's a required course for sophomores who have declared a major in education at all levels. And they take a block of these 3 courses. And then they also at the same time do a 51-hour field experience. They write a journal with 15 directed tasks, and they do a capstone during the semester. So they will have 3 professors at one time with these 3 classes. And this is the piece on diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you, I've taught a variety of courses, and it's a challenge for me with this course specifically is this tension that has arisen and stayed and maintained between, there's a clear expectation from the Georgia Board of Regents that our teacher candidates are aware of and prepared to teach students in diverse cultural contexts and environments in the spheres in which they, are going to be moving and living. So that's especially in the ways that American schools are designed today, that aren't always a good fit for diverse students. So I feel this increasing tension between the expectation of covering this material and a growing number of federal and Georgia policies and legislation that have directly targeted and limited and challenged us being able to cover these concepts, and have really increased the hesitation and discomfort of my teacher candidates, and how are they going to cover concepts in a way that keeps them employed and keeps them from having a lot of community pushback, a lot of issues with their principals, their administrators, their colleagues in settings that are our typical kind of Georgian classroom settings. So what I've developed over time is what I guess it's most likely called a context-based approach. I try to, and it changes over time and has changed a lot over time, but really, I really explore the current context of the students that I have, and how they operate within these rapidly changing social, political norms of the university, their school systems, their state, their federal spheres of education. And I've just listed here some generalized characteristics of there's no such thing as a typical student, but a lot of students I see kind of trend in this course, trend right of center, generally politically. They reflect about 2/3 of Georgia residents who identify as Christian. They are majority white students with some diversity, obviously, but you still see that tension in education settings. We still do see more of a proportion of white teacher candidates still. They do reflect the national average of 21% of students with exceptionalities. We do have a small number of students, international students, not particularly in the College of Education. They're less represented here. And many of our international students are not English speakers, but those would not necessarily, our students would not necessarily come into contact with them. We do have about almost 2/3 of our first year students receive need-based aid. There are some university resources for LGBTQ plus students. However, there has been some campus pushback on those initiatives, and a lot of our initiatives and direct-to-student digital resources were removed as of 2024. And one thing that is really important to the context, I think, of my classes, particularly in my approach, is that we really do in the College of Ed, although we do have non-traditional kind of students who are returning after raising a family or moving from another content, or parapros, changing and getting a certificate for education. 2/3 of our students are young, and they're traditional students. They're here for 4 years, seeking those 4-year degrees. So part of that context is they really do, a lot of them I have found, especially over time, as they've kind of gone away from, longer and longer time has passed between critical, historical periods of strong advocacy and visibility of marginalized people. A lot of my students are young. They come from areas within Georgia, that from communities that kind of resemble the university community and the demographics and their experiences. And I find that they really do lack that feeling of culture shock. You know, a lot of times going to college, having that culture shock is a catalyst for, you know, just suddenly finding out that, hey, not everybody is like me. I'll have conversations. I'll meet people that are different from me or from people that I have met. Also within the education program, most of our students maybe don't have the interest, or either personal interest or professional interest. Fewer students seem to have that interest in history and sociology and politics. Most education majors are elementary ed majors. We have fewer middle grades and secondary history majors. So I just see that there may be not an interest in pursuing anything beyond what they learned in, you know, middle grades and high school. So as a result, I really have found more and more that my students just have these critical gaps. They just don't have personal knowledge. They're not maybe necessarily interested. They don't have life experience gaps in having to kind of confront and explore issues of privilege and equity and inclusion. If they do have biases or prejudices, they just are either unaware of them. They're unaccustomed to examining their areas of privilege and other inequitable power dynamics, or they are socialized, you know, to actively deny or hide them. These are kids that were born after 9/11. It's now their grandparents or great grandparents who marched on Washington. It may be their grandparents or great grandparents that had to, you know, go to a sit-in to get Section 504 regulations passed, or who were at Stonewall, right? Or who were bused across town, or who experienced gender discrimination before Title IX, or were hungry before free lunch in schools. They just don't see those systemic inequities because to them in 2026, they're invisible. They just don't acknowledge that they're there. And me just telling them that they're there I've not found that to be effective. Engaging in text and discussion without a context has not really been effective for me. So my approach really is about it's kind of a three-pronged approach, I guess. One is clearly helping to fill in those knowledge deficits, and then investigating where and how those systemic inequities still exist, even if they're hidden or embedded or difficult to see, in the schools where they are and they're going to be in the future. And then doing some strategizing to think about how can I, within the boundaries and the parameters, you know, where I'm going to be teaching, in this current political and social context, how can I do those? How can I do those with, you know, and make sure I can do everything else I need to do? And then this kind of overarching effect is that I really try to establish these operational boundaries in the classroom. We spend some time developing a common definition of culture, which is broad and inclusive. We have presentations at the beginning of the semester where I and all my students share our own influences, our own contexts, you know, where we came from and how it's impacted us, and as far as where we got our worldview, what possible areas of privilege have our ancestors had that allowed things to happen, what areas that have not, you know, have been barriers or blockaded from them. I insist on respectful dialogue, and confidentiality of everything we say in class. And I think really importantly, I really rely on as neutral as possible data sources. If I'm trying to avoid quote ideological readings of text. Not that I think that those are not good for students to approach, but at this level where they are sophomores and really trying to get their feet wet and understanding these issues, I really want this inductive approach of they are finding out and becoming alert to current gaps to access and inequities, and where people have been excluded, and the fact that it's not over, it's not fixed in 2026, and how they can move forward and provide access to the students they have. And I always focus on children. You know, it's always about children. It's not about taking their personal opinions about the behaviors of adults or the behaviors of groups, or, you know, judgmental types of opinions about anything. It's about children. They're being impacted, and how can we fix that so that you are going to be of service to children? So I did just develop, example 3 slides of each step, just in case that, is kind of confusing of what that would look like in a classroom. Um, and so, sometimes I get comments from my students of like, I didn't know this was a history class. It's like, well, of course, we have to know the past before we can kind of figure out what is appropriate to do in the future, especially when there's this deficit of life experience and knowledge. And so we do some investigations into particularly historical kind of turning points with specific historically disadvantaged or marginalized groups. This is just one kind of sample of some of the things we talk about in one unit in a class. So this is like a 4-week unit that we start with on race, power, and schools. And we look at investigating factual, and historical events that have contributed to a longer trajectory, or barriers have been thrown up to groups who are marginalized and who experience inequity. So here's some examples that we look at, and we talk about specifically, what was the promise of their Reconstruction and how was it changed? Why did that promise go unmet? We talk about what Jim Crow laws were, how was sharecropping just basically de facto slavery, and what did that look like? And then, how did the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance and other movements kind of contribute to the growing civil rights movements in the USA? And then we talk about how those were perpetuated through segregational policies or practices like redlining and white flight and realtor steering, and how that created barriers to people of color being able to establish wealth and generational wealth, which is kind of the key to power and access too, of being able to have equity in housing and finding jobs and having equitable schools. We talk about Brown versus Board of Ed, of course, and how that impacted, why we had a real lack of Black teachers after Brown versus Board of Education. How the Voting Rights Act in '65, how did that affect it? And then kind of the aftermath, busing in the private school movement. And really we look at kind of how schools have in some ways become resegregated and why that's happening, and what the impact is on that. So we look at a lot of kind of historical facts and trends and social political movements, and kind of what the effect has been, mainly on how has that contributed to a slower trajectory to gaining access than the majority population had. And then we take a lot of sources. We look for as neutral sources as possible of data. If they're not, we talk about what agenda may be affecting the neutrality of sources. But here's some specific kind of examples of things I've used as they're investigating current access, power, or achievement gaps among students. We look at a lot of the NCES statistics. We look at the Department of Justice, the discipline reports, to see that we really are looking at a school to prison pipeline among students who, disproportionate numbers of students with exclusionary discipline, students of color. We look at Georgia. This is our, this is our career and college ready performance index. This is the way we grade our schools. Indicators like test scores, and we look for achievement gaps, and we find them. They're constantly kind of amazed at, like, why is that true? And well, that's what we talk about. Why do we still see achievement gaps when every student, no matter where they're from, they have this innate ability to succeed at a high level? Why aren't they? What are we not doing right yet? We look at Shelby v. Holder, and how that's having a huge impact on voting access. We look at SCOTUS blog. We look at some other, reporting sources that are, I feel like are fairly good neutral sources. We also look at, especially in this area of the country, there's a intersection of race with socioeconomic status, and how the structure of education funding in the U.S. really continues to perpetuate inequities because it's so based on wealth. We look at TANF and SNAP and Title I statistics, U.S. Census data, poverty, home ownership, use the Pew Research Center a good deal. We also look at kind of where are we going forward? What are some things that are coming along? We look at all, major political parties. We just study their education platforms. We look at their budgets. Where are they putting their money? What that usually tells you what the trends are. We track legislation that's going through all states and also the U.S. and in Georgia specifically, in a variety of topics related to schools and school students. Look at where technology trends are going. We've looked at post-COVID effects and so on. And then this investigation tends to, what I found and again is that there's this kind of awakening of students understanding, which is that joy of the inductive approach, is that I am not telling them, hey, there are achievement gaps, power gaps, just, trust me on this, because that tends to be kind of shut down students a little bit. Well, maybe a lot in some cases. They either kind of brand you as being, oh, it's all ideological, so I'm just going to tell that professor what I think they want to hear, and they don't really open themselves up to risk-taking, open-mindedness, because you're coming at it from not a neutral, but in that inductive approach, so that they are more willing to have conversations that are uncomfortable. Then they are not going to kind of not believe what they're seeing. So it's helpful. It's helpful in a lot of cases where you might have students that are kind of more on the end of the continuum and being very skeptical about this. And so then we do spend a lot of time. There's a clinical task that they do for their journal. They read about culturally responsive practices, and then they analyze their clinical setting to see if they see responsive practices or harmful practices in their setting. We look at ACEs, we look at adverse childhood experiences and what to look for. What does that look like in students who are experiencing that, so they can at least be alert to, finding sources of help for students that are experiencing marginalization or trauma some way. And a lot of them are what are things that are practicable for them as new teachers? What are research-based interventions for students who are transient or absent, who are marginalized, who are bullied, who exhibit, differences from either the norm or from each other? And how can they make sure that these interventions, instructional strategies are culturally relevant to the students from their points of view and not, majority centered? We look at the correlates of effective schools and the research body there, and which teacher skills and dispositions, along with, climate factors, highly correlate with those. And how can they be an advocate and be a new teacher at the same time? And what if my colleagues, what if parents, what if the community are not supportive? What are ways we can build in and integrate support for all students on a continuum, how comfortable they are doing that, especially getting kind of settled as new teachers. And also looking at their students from a resource-based perspective rather than a deficit-based perspective. So that's an important kind of an important feeling, but it's like, how can I have empowerment to do those things? And so a lot of these strategies, these range from a lot of discussions. There are small reflection papers. There's some group activities. There's just a real variety, kind of trying to triangulate how, to build their strategies at this level when they're just getting their feet wet in this pre-professional block of just seeing what classrooms are like, and so on. And anyway, that's been effective for me. I find the students find it pretty, at least enjoyable. They like the discussions. They're often, you often hear, I didn't know that. I didn't have any idea that had happened. I didn't understand that had happened. And so that's really valuable to me. As far as, I know one of the questions that you sent ahead of time was, what kind of responses do you get? And as a professor, we look at student ratings and comments and things like that. And I have not seen any type of difference in my student ratings of instruction and comments for this course versus other kind of less, sensitive courses that I teach. They're just very right there with the other types of ratings. I'm often assigned multiple sections of this course. So as far as my department chairs and other colleagues being comfortable with me covering this material, I take that as a sign. And I've taught this course at least once, sometimes multiple times every semester for um, 18 years. So um, it's been interesting. So if those are measures of success, then I hope that it's been successful. But that is pretty much it for me. I really appreciate the opportunity. As I am entering retirement now, I appreciate the opportunity to reflect, on my approaches over time, and if I'm able to offer any kind of perspective or information on maybe a way to go about this, especially with very young, fairly protected, sometimes very naive students who just may not have that foundation of understanding, then I'm happy to do that, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you so much,
Sure.
Ms. Tharp. That was really a great presentation. And as we transition to Dr. Riley's presentation, I'll open up the chat for any additional comments or questions for Ms. Tharp that anybody has on their mind before we get into the next presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Okay. Looks like we're all set then. So I will go ahead and give you the floor, Dr. Riley.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate Kelly, a lot of the things that you talked about is sort of also how I structure classroom. And so it's good to know that I'm doing the right things as you come upon retirement and I'm still an early faculty member. So yeah, thank you so much for um, inviting me. I think, when I thought about this topic, I try to think about ways that I help students um, navigate their learning as sort of like investigators and just being curious about certain topics. So similar to Kelly said, we're contrary to what people believe, we're not ideological. We're not trying to place our beliefs on students. So a lot of the things that I'll talk about today are just things that I naturally do in the classroom, and I'll try to give some examples that have come up before. I've taught adolescent development to students who were secondary ed majors, so those who wanted to be middle school and high school teachers. And now I teach more youth development prevention science. I'm a developmental psychologist in training, and I mostly focus on adolescents. So helping them to sort of navigate topics that adolescents go through is important. Things like identity development and how that might be important to kids who are marginalized. One of the things that I try to do early on is really learn my classroom and not just the students, right? So we have, your first day where I'm asking them their name and major and like why they chose the class, but also learn a little bit about what sort of appeals to them about what we're talking about or about their careers as secondary ed teachers, things like that. And so as I'm learning my classroom, I have to remember myself that I need to be willing to adjust based on different sort of majors and things that people are interested in. To be cautious of what my assumptions are of my classroom. As I mentioned, um, I've taught at Indiana University, which is kind of like college town, but a little more rural. And now I'm at UF, which is college town, a little less rural. So be cautious of my assumptions of students and then recognize when there may be potential bottlenecks or places where I think students might get stuck on a particular topic. And so I really try to go in with this idea to learn who my students are in the classroom. And so what I'll focus on today is really, as I mentioned, how I develop courses. It doesn't matter what the course is, if it's a grad or undergrad course, there are three major things that come up in my objectives that I want students to know. Understanding foundational knowledge on a particular topic, then critically evaluating that research on a topic area. So looking at different sources and then understanding the practical application, because whether or not they're going to be youth service providers or teachers or whatever, they need to understand how science becomes a part of our everyday lives or a part of what we do every day. So when it comes to foundational knowledge, one of the things that we often talk about is theory. And like Erickson's psychosocial theory is really important to adolescents. So it's about how adolescents learn who they are, what their social roles are, right? And for marginalized youth, a lot of times that's their social positioning. So what SES class am I in, or what have people said, or what is the history of Black people, right? So what is my social position in the world? And so I try to come to them with this long-standing theory that has been around for forever, but also help them to apply it to sort of new sort of social issues that come about. And I tend to position theory as this is not just like opinion when you think about it. It's built on multiple perspectives and how people view the world. It often is adaptive. So we may see one theory from like 1960, but then we'll see an updated version as things have changed. And then oftentimes theory is contested by other theories or even enhanced by other theories, right? So people may add on and or they may say, let's try it to do it this way. Essentially what I'm trying to help them understand in foundational knowledge is that multiple perspectives are important, right? And that's sort of what people, I guess, would point or think of as like viewpoint diversity, right? So trying to help them understand that. So here's an example of an in-class assignment where we often debate a theory. So there's a long-standing theory about how we teach sex education within schools. And again, this is for the class where students are learning to be secondary teachers. And so we talk a little bit about their experience with sex education and what that looks like for them. We talk about the theory that says all we need is parental supervision or all we need is to get them better friends, right? So changing the context. And then we talk about the theory that says, yes, that's nice. And we need to supply them with information, available resources, how to engage in relationships safely. And then we think about what this might look like for marginalized youth, like LGBTQ youth, youth who come from certain cultural backgrounds, that type of thing, right? And so we debate this theory, and I sort of show them that there is academic quote unquote beef. And so what side are you on? Do you take this approach or are you a yes and approach? And we kind of debate it out in class. Oftentimes they'll write a reflection as well. So if there's something that came up in class that maybe they weren't comfortable saying, they can say within their reflection and have like an individual conversation almost. The other way that we do this is, as I mentioned, I try to allow them to know that theory can adjust based on topic, based on time. And this is the theory of planned behavior. So this is how people change their health behaviors. And so in this class, we're often talking about there's a disparity in cardiovascular risk for Black or African American populations. How do we get people to do things like walk more, right? We have this walk initiative type of thing in Florida. What leads to their behavioral change? They have to have a certain attitude about the change. What do people around them think is the norm? And do they perceive that they have control to change their behaviors, right? And so oftentimes I like using theory because they have these models and they could add on additional things that they think are interesting or that may help a particular group, that type of thing. We often talk about needing to engage with the community first. So like, what would the community say is important to planned behavior, right? What is a subjective norm that the community has about walking or about exercising or about healthy living? So that's just an example of how we sort of go through theory. So once they've gained that foundational knowledge, I try to help them critically evaluate the research. I will say upon entering into the class, like the first week, we do sort of go through this, like how to be a good consumer of good research. Because there are a lot of things out there, right, that they could look for, that they could Google, but how to do this in a way that you know that you're getting a reputable source or from an expert or things like that. So we kind of engage in like good searching first, something that they don't always have before coming into class. I ask them to collect evidence on a particular topic that they're interested in. What do we already know about it? What's currently being done, and how can we improve? And because students are allowed to do a range of different activities or behaviors, they come up with all sorts of things. So I don't have to say like, I want you to critically evaluate this topic. Their sort of viewpoint on like what's an important issue always comes up for them, right? And so some of these questions could be things like I had someone recently who was interested in urban planning. That's about, when we place that in the context of health, that's about like who gets to be in what places and when and where, right? And so that type of like consumer research on evidence, like what do we know, where potentially are the disparities and what's being done about it. The other thing that I try to help them do with evaluating the research is that to know that there are multiple experts. And so not just the research that they are looking at and evaluating, but also their practitioners and teachers and their community members. And I do this because I want them to know that multiple perspectives, not just mine, are the things that lead to some of the things that we talk about in class. Here's one assignment that we do to help them understand that, particularly in one of the classes where there are people from different majors, not just education majors, but I have them build a bridge out of paper, tape, and a few other supplies. And their bridge has to hold whatever's in my bag that day. It could be like my clementines, it could be like a bunch of quarters that I have, but their bridge has to hold this up. And I asked them to think about what's your strategy? Did you use your previous knowledge? What was the theory and evidence? And who was responsible for what aspects? And so sometimes there are people who their group happens to have an engineering major. Well, great for them because they probably built a really nice suspension bridge, whereas other people have biochemists in their group, right? And so thinking about like, how did you come up with this? What previous knowledge do you have about bridges and how they weigh? And what were their multiple expertise? And how did you figure out what to do? And so this sort of helps them understand that hopefully the things that we are intervening on, interventions, community interventions, policies, the ways that we sort of do things are built on people's multiple perspectives and that they have a viewpoint too that I want to hear about and learn about. And then lastly is application to the real world. I try to make sure that they base this on theory that we learned previously. Again, what is the current evidence and have you spoken to or read with multiple experts, right? We need multiple sort of viewpoints on this idea. And there's a couple of ways that we've done this. There's an investigative paper where each person in their group will interview an expert. And not only are they interviewing professors on campus, but I ask them to interview a community member, a nonprofit director, and sort of like figure out what the sort of challenges and how people are thinking about it. So one example, someone was interested recently in uh, things, food insecurity in particular, in a particular area of the city of Gainesville. And so they talked to different people on food insecurity, how that affects kids, how that affects them at school, how that's affecting families. I also try to get them to attend policy meetings. So I had never been to a school board meeting until I was well an assistant professor and working with a group of kids who wanted to go to a school board meeting. And so I found them really interesting. And so now I incorporate that into their projects, like attend some type of county council meeting or school board meeting where you can understand what the community sees as a potential challenge. And inevitably, some of these pressing issues that uh, Kelly just talked about come up for them as far as what they've learned. And then how are they being addressed? And then the other assignment that I do for application, which I really like, is that they have to convince a policymaker that they should change something. And this is all based on what we've learned in class, based on theory, based on some of the evidence, right? So they choose a topic, they write a letter. They don't have to send it off, but I do tell them that, your perspective, your voice is important, and they have to include these suggestions for change. And we've had a number of things. This is one of my favorite ones to do in the adolescent course because people have done like school dress code, violence prevention, all the sort of things that you would think about, like what would you want a policymaker to know about what we know about adolescence and how can we translate that into policy? Because oftentimes what we see is that people do a bunch of research, but policymakers are like, oh yeah, that looks interesting, but that's not what I think should be done. So how do we translate what you know, your knowledge, into policy for these folks? Here are some other lessons that I've learned. Students' experiences in their own community. I think Kelly talked about this, like our worldview and how we develop that worldview is so important. Oftentimes I'll have them map out their neighborhood and share them with us about like how their neighborhood influenced their own development and their own ideas and thoughts. I do allow some flexibility on topics. So sometimes at the beginning of the course, I'll say, what do you guys want to talk about? And people sort of assume that because of a lot of the new policies that students aren't going to come up with these ideas or critical topics. They 100% are like, we want to learn about these things. And we do it through Google Docs so that everyone can like have their opinion of what they are interested in. We do some democratic voting, right? So it doesn't just lean on like, this is what I want you to learn, but this is what we've come up with as a learning community. And then I lean on students and what students know and how they get their information. I think the best thing about teaching college students is that they're so close to adolescence. They are adolescents, is what I tell them. They don't want to believe that, but they are. And so when I teach about adolescence, I have them lean on their own experiences. What was it like for you in high school? Would you have wanted your teacher to know this about you or this about your identity and how you sort of grew up and things like that? So I lean on what they know and have them uh, incorporate that into their learning. So here's my summary. I try to allow students to lead a lot of what they do. So there's a lot of options in the course. I let them sort of choose what they're interested in, which always excites me because I learn from them. Help them recognize that the science that I'm teaching them is adaptive, collaborative, and also malleable. Encourage curiosity about particular topics. So things that they had no idea about is what I try to encourage, that curiosity to then go investigate, and then provide opportunity to learn from multiple experts. So that's sort of going out and learning from community members. I often have like panels come in, especially nonprofits, to help think about like what are the challenges communities and marginalized communities in particular are facing, and what are they learning that could sort of help in addressing some of those issues. So that's all I have for you. As I mentioned, my courses are sort of like these foundational courses, but inevitably some of these critical topics come up, and I hope that I keep students curious about learning more about what's going on, these social challenges.
Great. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Dr. Riley. I loved how you framed kind of debating about theory as something that scholars also do to give students a chance to think like scientists. I think that's really wonderful. And similar to how we did with Kelly, if anybody has questions for Dr. Riley, feel free to put them in the chat as we transition to Mr. Crawford's presentation.
All right. Once again, my name is Alan Crawford. I am a history teacher at Waite High School in Toledo, Ohio. I've been doing it for a while. Recently, just got my master's degree, and I have essentially my presentation is more so going to focus on best practices and things that I have done as an instructor. So I'll go ahead and get started. Let me get this chat on my screen so I can see what I'm talking about. Okay. Everybody seeing everything okay, I hope. Doing the work when it matters most, teaching race in the classroom. My slideshow is a little bit messed up, but I am going to continue anyway. Um, so
I
really
haven't
quick,
taken
I want to
anything.
touch. I'm sorry. Okay. Really quick, I just kind of want to touch on what my philosophy is when it comes to teaching these critical race topics and critical history topics in the classroom. I operate from historical integrity. If it is something that is, a part of the curriculum that is valid and that is applicable, I'm going to present it in my classroom. Um, as instructors, we are not curators of comfort. In this current political climate, a lot of what's going on with, the powers that be and the people are in power is that they're trying to curate comfort amongst a minority, quite frankly. It is not our jobs as educators and as professionals to cater to that. Um, I forget which presenter it was. Forgive me, I'm a little nervous, so I was in and out. But I heard one of our presenters talking about history or teaching these things is kind of being touchy, and once people graduate from their education programs because of different policies and things being put in place, our future educators and current students being nervous to teach about these things. Well, I want to reassure you, um it's a moral thing. You're not gonna be, or you shouldn't be, a political martyr because you're teaching historical facts. Okay. I hope that takes a little bit of pressure off of you when you think about these things being presented, in the classroom. You're doing your job essentially. I think it's best to simplify our thought process when it comes to these things. I teach history not to assign guilt, but to build literacy, historical literacy, civic literacy, emotional literacy. Understanding systems of race helps students better understand their country and their world. When we do teach these things, we are helping our students to become more informed citizens, which in turn makes our society better. So, think of it as doing your, due diligence and helping society progress. All right. So let's keep going. So, when we talk about history, accuracy is better than comfort. History is evidence-based. The current political climate is a result of catering to the comfort of minority. Anything that is documented, anything that has factually taken place should be taught. We don't want to sensationalize things. We don't want to omit truths and facts because we're, worried about repercussions. And I understand, I do live in a state like Ohio. I teach in a state like Ohio. I couldn't imagine what it would be like as far as backlash teaching in somewhere like Florida or Georgia. So I do give credence to that. But we do have a moral and my opinion, a professional obligation to teach, history as it happens or as it happened. One thing that I try to do is I don't want students to feel blamed when it comes to teaching these specific topics. We, or more so myself, one thing I do as far as best practice is that I emphasize systems and not individuals. All right. Institutionalized racism, things of that, relics that we still have in place from slavery and things like that. Those are a part of a system. Those are not, individuals being pointed out and being blamed for how things are. And that can kind of help curtail, students kind of feeling, guilt or, am I being blamed for these circumstances? Am I being blamed for, the marginalization of other people, if that makes sense? Um, I kind of touched on building skills in the first slide. I want to kind of touch on that right now as well. When we talk about building skills, when we're teaching these critical things, we're talking about source analysis skills. We're building well-rounded perspectives because we're talking about everything. We're not omitting things. We're, developing evidence-based argumentative skills because we're presenting factual evidence. We don't want to present these things as if we are telling our students what to think. We're giving them the information, we're presenting the information and allowing them to, process the information they're getting and then form their own thoughts. So, when we go into it from that perspective, I feel like, we're doing a good job as far as teaching, critical topics. So, some best practices I do want to touch on, as far as what I like to do when I do teach critical race topics. Um, I'm going to list them and then kind of elaborate on each one. Anchor everything in primary resources. Establish classroom norms, which I think is very important, but sometimes can be taken very lightly. We kind of do it as, a routine cliche thing, but when we establish those classroom norms and expectations, it creates an environment of comfort rather. Distinguish between facts and interpretations, normalize discomfort, and teach the entire picture. Now, gonna try to unpack each one. Okay. Primary resources. Some examples I came up with, and I'm gonna give you guys a specific one that I've used: enslavement narratives, Reconstruction legislation, redlining maps, voting rights acts, the text of those different things. One of the biggest ways that I was able to use primary resources this current school year was in February. I teach contemporary history, I teach American history, and also government at the current high school I work at. For my contemporary history class, I kind of can have my way with that, so to say. So for Black History Month, I did lessons that were rooted or based off of the 1619 Project. Us being in education and academia and being, conscious, as far as what's going on in our world, in our country, we know that years ago, the 1619 Project was a very hot button topic, especially, in states like Georgia and Texas and Arkansas and states in the South. So, I don't take it lightly that it's not really a pressing matter in Ohio and that there's not really going to be backlash from me teaching from this, curriculum. But essentially, part of what I did was I took the Declaration of Independence, text in that document, and I took the Virginia Slave Codes, text in that document, and I compared the two. And, I had students analyze text like, all men are created equal, Declaration of Independence, versus Virginia slave codes that essentially said that Black people were property, and the contradiction in those two things. And I had students analyze those primary resources. So when we do use primary resources as the anchor for what we are teaching, you know, those things are factual. It kind of prevents us from, being opinion based or anything like that because those are factual contradictions. All right. Establishing classroom norms. Let's see. I'm sorry. I'm kind of looking at notes as well. What you want to do when we talk about establishing classroom norms is we want to emphasize the importance of respect. Everybody's opinion, everybody's perspectives are important and they are to be respected, even if we do not agree with them. We don't want to attack people personally. We don't want to attack people for what they believe in. And when we do argue and when we do disagree, we want to present our point of view. We want to present our perspective and our argument based off of evidence. It is so easy, especially when we talk about these critical topics, to get caught up in emotion and what we believe things should be. We want to keep it purely evidence-based. So distinguish between facts or interpretations. Um, One of the biggest ways that I find myself doing this in practice is being intentional with language. This document states, for instance, or historians debate, or the data shows this. When we are intentional with the language that we use to present things to our students, it creates a context where this is factual. This is not my personal or even professional interpretation of this. This is what happened and this is what I'm presenting. All right. Normalizing discomfort. A lot of things that have happened in this country's history, a lot of touchy subjects when it comes to critical race topics are just going to be uncomfortable, no matter what side of it you're on. Discomfort isn't a bad thing necessarily. Growth often requires that tension. You know what I'm saying? It requires for your preconceived notions to be challenged. It requires for, you not having prior knowledge of something and then you gaining that knowledge can kind of be shocking. It can kind of, create, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, that culture shock that, so many students who may come from a privileged background or may just not experience those things day in and day out. They might be like, wow, this exists in my country. This exists in my world. It may create discomfort. But just because your perspectives and beliefs are being challenged or even how you believe life to go is being challenged, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just broadening the picture for our students. So, normalizing that discomfort is a way to prepare students for, the knowledge that they're about to receive. Okay. And then teaching the entire picture. I think this is a huge thing. We don't want to just teach the bad things. We don't want to just teach slavery or Jim Crow or segregation. We want to create a full picture. We want to teach abolition movements. We want to teach Reconstruction, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. We want to teach civil rights victories. We want to teach, present day efforts, whether we're talking about last decade with Black Lives Matter, whether we're talking about the push for, new legislation right now in Congress and things like that. We want to give students the full perspective so they can gain a full level of knowledge on what we're learning, if that makes sense. So, why teach this stuff? One of the biggest reasons why I don't shy away from teaching critical race topics is because students are already having these conversations. college students, high school students, like the presenter prior to me said, they are adolescents, are college students, even though they are adults and, engage in, adult activities inside and outside of academia. They are still adolescent and their mind is still being developed. Um, we have a duty and an obligation to provide structure to those thoughts as educators. We want to give them evidence-based frameworks. We want to give them a perspective, or not even a perspective, but a way of understanding race. A lot of times they're getting their opinions from things like TikTok and social media and things like that. And we all know misinformation, especially in this day and age, can spread like wildfire. We want to be a grounded force in the sense of we are experts in this field and we have influence on our students, whether or not they want to admit it, especially with me, teaching teenagers. They try to act like, you're the vein of their existence, but you do have influence over your students as educators. And we want to exercise that influence in a positive way by helping to, mold the not so much what they think, but the way they think. Um, Teaching history with fidelity and integrity helps them to develop critical thinking skills, see past online narratives and things that may be, false. So, in conclusion, our job is not to protect students from history. Our job is to prepare them for citizenship. And citizenship requires clarity about how we got here. So I hope what I presented did offer you future educators, some perspective and some best practices on how to teach these race topics. Because it's not easy in this, climate. I have yet to come across, students or parents that were outraged, and I'm fortunate in that regard. But I'm sure it'll happen if I keep living and keep, being in this arena. So thank you for your time, and I hope I was able to help.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. Crawford. And thank you, all of our presenters, for such rich, really helpful presentations. I will acknowledge that we are about 2 minutes until closing time. That being said, if anybody has some last minute questions that they want to ask, we're totally fine with staying a couple minutes over, but understand if anybody has to get going real quick. Thank you to everybody who attended. And I'll just leave a little bit of room for some last minute questions while we do our closing time. Okay, so I'm going to go into a quick little closing and then I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. But thank you so much again to our wonderful presenters for their insights. I'm already thinking about so many things that I want to implement in my classroom, and I'm sure that you guys are wanting to implement in yours. We wanted to let everybody know that this webinar is part of a series hosted by APA Division 15 Social Justice and Equity in Education Committee. So in case you missed it, last semester we hosted a webinar on student voice to inform educational policy. And you can find a recording of that session on our YouTube channel. We're also going to be hosting additional webinars in the summer and the fall, one focused on publishing in the current climate, and then the other one focused on equity-centered research practices. So keep an eye out for those sessions in the coming weeks, and we hope that you can all join us there. And thanks to Dr. Chen for putting that link in the chat. And then I will turn it over to Elizabeth for a little note on our sponsors.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Molly. So this was sponsored by APA Division 15 and AERA's TEP SIG, which is the Teaching of Educational Psychology SIG. So thank you very much to them for putting this on, and our fabulous organizers, and especially our presenters who shared their perspectives today. If you are a member of AERA and are not a member of the Teaching of Educational Psychology SIG, please absolutely come join us. We are fabulous and would love to have you. So that's all I've got to say. But if you've got any additional questions, please absolutely reach out to one of us via the chat, and we would love to connect with you.